Layers of the abdominal wall cross-section. A problem with body wall anatomy is that a student of anatomy, as they start learning the abdominal wall, becomes quickly overwhelmed by the litany of the terminology and they choke on the jargon. And this is especially true when it comes to this word fascia. A lot of times these anatomical terms are self-descriptive, but it's hard for students to see those individual terms in the big picture, and they often forget. So they'll be taught the anatomy between here and here of the lateral body wall and learn dozens and dozens of terms, and then they start learning a bunch of different terms for the front of the body wall, and then they'll also for the back of the body wall. And often what happens is the following. As they're learning these dozens and dozens of anatomical terms, preparing for some form of test, they throw them into the closet of their minds and just throw them inside there. And then when they go to retrieve them, it takes a while to find, or if they even find it at all. And so Mark Nielsen from Lower Campus of the University of Utah Department of Biology helped me to see a better way of looking and teaching at the abdominal anatomy. And that is to think of it in a pattern and to take all this terminology and organize it into shelves in your mind, that no matter what term structure that you find in the abdominal wall, you place them into 7 concrete shelves. And that way, every time you learn a new term, you put it on its appropriate layered shelf, and it's easier to go back to retrieve. And those 7 layers as follows: skin, hypodermis, external muscle fascia, muscle and associated aponeuroses, internal muscle fascia, extracoelomic tissue, and finally a coelomic sac. And coelomic sac is the term I'll use for the mesothelium lining that internal surface of the body cavity. Terminology. So looking at this, some of you might be saying, well, I recognize skin, and I recognize hypodermis, and muscle and aponeuroses. That's going to be those muscles derived from the somites. But some of these other ones are a little bit more dodgy, and I don't quite recognize them, but we'll cover them as we go to help you become more familiar. And the power of this is any tissue layer of the abdominal wall will fall into one of these layers no matter what we are learning. You might also be saying colors. There's definitely some type of a theme going on with the colors. What's going on there? So we take a look at that, we'll recognize that there is a symmetry in the histology, and that the colors represent the symmetry in the tissues found in these 7 layers. For example, in the skin and the coelomic sac, it's epithelium with some connective tissue. In the hypodermis and extracoelomic tissue, there's adipose tissue or fat and connective tissue. The external muscle and internal muscle fascia is dense connective tissue, and it forms a sandwich of top and bottom layers of bread to the muscle and aponeuroses, the skeletal muscle, with the dense connective tissue regularly arranged, making up the aponeuroses. And so there is that, the colors representing the symmetry in the histology of these 7 layers going from out, external to deep. All right, now let's do the same thing, cover those same 7 layers, except using this picture from Netter's Atlas. This is a cross-section through the abdomen. It's an anatomical image. So anterior is at the top of the screen. There's the left, and there's the right. This is from foot to head. In contrast, it's not the same way as looking at an axial section of a CT or MR. So let's start with the skin. That's the very outside layer, and it's comprised of the epidermis and the dermis. Epidermis is is stratified squamous epithelium with keratin, and the dermis is this dense connective tissue, and the prefix hypo means below. So this is the layer below the dermis. And this is primarily fat. And in the abdomen, there's 2 layers of this fat. There's called Camper's fascia. It's the superficial layer of the hypodermis, and it's primarily adipose tissue and fat. But there's this deeper layer called Scarpa's fascia, and it's made of dense connective tissue, and it's the deepest layer of that hypodermis. The next is this external muscle fascial layer, and it's outlined in blue, and it circumscribes, goes all the way around, and it's made of dense connective tissue, and it has different names from where it's located. Like there at the back, it's called thoracolumbar fascia, and here on the side, it's the fascia that's surrounding the external oblique muscle, and in the front, it's this blending with the fascia of the rectus sheath. So all of these anatomical terms all belong to the same layer, the external muscle fascia, which is below the epidermis but superficial to our muscle and their associated aponeuroses. And so looking at these muscle layers and start thinking, how can we start looking for these friendly faces? Well, look, there's our ventral strap muscle, and there's our 4-layered body wall. It might not look it, but it'll explain it. And then there's our subvertebral muscle. Well, that ventral strap muscle in the abdomen is called the rectus abdominis muscle. It's your six-pack. At the bottom, we have this tiny pyramidalis muscle in the same plane we'll talk about later. What about this 4-layered body wall? Well, layers 1 and 2 is the external oblique muscle. It has a supracostal layer and a body wall layer. And there's really 2 layers to this external oblique. And then layer 3 is our internal oblique muscle, and layer 4 is the transverse abdominis muscle, and there's also another muscle called the quadratus lumborum. So there's our 4-layered body wall. And the subvertebral layer is called the psoas major. There's a tiny psoas minor muscle as well. But there's our muscles then, derived from that somite, that we find within the 7-layered body wall. Then the inside lining of those muscles is this internal muscle fascia, this dense connective tissue as well. And so the primary way that this fascia is anatomically named is the transversalis fascia. It's deep to the transversus abdominis muscle. And this transversalis fascia is continuous with the fascia over the quadratus lumborum. It's called quadratus lumborum fascia, or over the psoas major, it's called psoas fascia, or it blends with the periosteum of the anterior longitudinal ligament of the vertebral bodies. But all of these, no matter where you're at, is the same layer, this internal muscle fascial layer. Next, extracoelomic tissue. This is the fatty adipose tissue and connective tissue layer that is between our internal muscle fascia and the coelomic sac. Well, here we call it pre-peritoneal fascia because this entire cavity in the middle is called the peritoneal cavity. So this is that fat that's before that. And then in the back side of the abdomen is this retroperitoneal fascia, or the fascia in the retroperitoneal space, which is behind or outside of this coelomic sac. Now, the coelomic sac that's outlined here in green is really, as I mentioned before, coelomic sac is a term used for the mesothelium lining that body cavity. And this is homologous to the parietal pleura and visceral pleura that we find in the thoracic cavity. Well, the coelomic sac on the side, we have the parietal layer of the coelomic sac. And then we have this other fold in the front called a median umbilical fold. It's one of them. But to the side are 2 medial umbilical folds, and then these 2 lateral or paired lateral umbilical folds. So what do all these things mean? Well, this parietal layer of the coelomic sac is another way of saying there's the parietal peritoneum. And then that medial umbilical fold is also that urachus. It's the obliterated urachus. And so when the urachus is in that pre-peritoneal space, when the coelomic sac covers it, they call it a medial umbilical ligament, but the median umbilical ligament, but the median umbilical ligament is just surrounding that urachus. These 2 medial umbilical folds are the coelomic sac surrounding the obliterated umbilical arteries, and then those lateral umbilical folds are basically covering the inferior epigastric arteries and veins, or those inferior epigastric vessels. So here we have all the basic layers of the abdominal body wall.